Welcome to the back room here at Luo's Peking House on Marion Street in Oak Park. Our guest today, I'm going to do a little bit of an introduction because
no one knows who I am. And I need more than a little introduction at my age.
Right. Well, and it'll wrap up with a bang. But our guest here he's got a long career in radio and TV here in Chicago. Began actually your career in college at the University of Wisconsin, right? As a matter of fact, that makes three of us.
Yeah, all three of us
are University of Wisconsin alumni.
Well, you all know Bascom Hill.
We do,
and you know the old what did we call? Was the old heating? Where WHA was in the old.
Oh gosh, like in the Lakeshore dorms.
It was awful. Like the chimney was there. It was where the heating unit originally was. And that's where they put the radio station. So I began in a coal bin, virtually.
And that's right off of like Observatory Drive, I think, right? And that was Frank Lloyd Wright really liked that building.
Yes, he would.
Yeah.
Okay.
I remember that.
Yeah.
And so,
right or wrong, he would have.
And then
enjoyed it.
After college, you got a job, and we'll get to this part of your story later on. But you were a DJ in Mason City, Iowa.
That was the first
job.
That was technically the second paying job. The first paying job in radio was in Oak Park, Illinois. You may have heard of it. But there's a radio station in this town.
Yes, at the Oak Park Arms.
PNA,
a couple of blocks away. And my job was to type up the daily log for the talk show hosts.
Okay.
And at that time, the talk show hosts were the moneymakers for WOPA.
Right.
And instead of having one or two commercials, 15 an hour. So
different time.
1/4 of the hour was taken up with commercials. I had to break them up. If you ever listen to it, it would be getting into a good conversation. Excuse me, we have to break for a commercial. 6 commercials later, they came back on. They made a couple of bucks.
The good news is you won't be interrupted with a commercial break today.
Yes.
We have no sponsor.
That's right. And then after a couple of stints in Peoria and Springfield, then you made your big move to WLS in 1960. You're one of the original swinging 7 rock and roll DJs at WLS. And then you were there until about 64 when you moved to WMAQ. And then you began a second career
I began
in TV.
wandering, actually, because... Actually, you gave my whole biography there. You don't need me.
No,
but seriously, in answer to your question, when I left WLS, I went over to WMAQ Radio for a summer job. Mm-hmm. And the summer job evolved itself into full-time. Mm-hmm. I did the summer. I had 10 days off, and WMAQ was changing its format because WLS and WCFL and WJJD were changing formats in the sound of Chicago radio. So WMAQ, being owned by the National Broadcasting Company, which had a few dollars, decided they have to change a format or they're going to lose the radio station. So because I had been with WLS on a format change, I was eventually invited to an early evening show, which was, as I recall, 7 to 10, something of that nature, right before Jack Eigen went on the air with a talk show.
Okay.
And Jack Eigen always had interesting people, except not every night. And maybe 2 nights out of the 5 or 6 Jack was on, nobody. I was there.
Wow.
I was interviewed by Jack Eigen 4 or 5 times. I kept telling the same story, which is basically what I'm telling you, although it expanded after my Jack Eigen appearances.
Mm-hmm. That's right. So I guess that is kind of a long, winding way for me to actually now introduce you as our guest.
Well, it's a long-winded answer.
Yeah. Bob Hale is our guest, and one of the in addition to the long career you had in radio and TV, you also were party to a seminal moment in rock and roll history. This is back in your days when you were in Mason City, Iowa. You were the MC of the Winter Dance Party.
Winter Dance Party.
That was Buddy Holly's last show.
At the Surf Ballroom.
And party to the famous coin flip that ended up getting Richie Valens on the plane. And so I guess, why don't we just start there?
Sure.
And what I guess what I wanted to find out just first of all is, how did you get invited to be the MC of that show?
Well, it was part of my weekly appearance at the Surf Ballroom.
Okay.
When KRIB went on the air approximately 8 months earlier, they wanted to do, they were doing a weekly record hop with a local radio station, which was daytime only. Mm-hmm. Back then there were some stations, I guess we still have them, could only be on the air sunrise to sunset. And they were doing popular music. Well, we came in with only 250 watts compared to their 1,000, but we were on the air. We could be on the air 24 hours a day. And we became the popular station in northern Iowa with only 250 watts. And because of the popularity of the radio station, we took over the weekly record hop at the Surf Ballroom. And my general manager and the manager of the Surf Ballroom selected me. I don't know why. I guess because everybody else was doing something, or I looked like I needed...
Well, you were a young guy then.
I needed the extra money anyway.
You were, what, 24 or something like that?
25. Yeah,
Okay.
24, because I got married the next year. I was 25.
Mm-hmm.
And just basically a young kid. And to do a record... Well, I liked working in front of crowds.
How big a crowd was there that night?
We would have anywhere from 500 to 2,200.
That's a pretty big crowd.
And that night was probably the biggest teen crowd they'd ever had at the Surf. When you had Buddy Holly, Richie Valens, Big Bopper, Dion and the Belmonts. I forgot the one guy. Oh, why? I wish I had it in front of me. There was one fellow there. Oh, this is sort of embarrassing because I knew him, and he's still around. Mm-hmm. But all he did was record one or two tunes, and he really didn't want to do that. But he knew certain people in the business who were unsavory kind.
Okay.
They had money in a record company, so he sang. And it was a popular tune, and I am really, really mad at myself for not coming up with his name.
Well,
it may come back.
It'll pop up before we're done here, or we'll take a break and get it.
But so this was like a variety kind of a show, several, 5, 6 performers or acts.
And we broke it in half. We did the first half, second half. But what had happened, which made it even more interesting, is that Dion and the Belmonts had been hit with, well, they'd all been hit with bad weather. Buddy Holly played the drums for Dion and the Belmonts because their drummer was in the hospital with frostbite. So Buddy...
Yeah, this was like the tour, whoever arranged this tour, like, apparently went on a shoestring because they had a bus that kept breaking down, and that's how this drummer ended up with frostbite. The bus broke down in the middle of nowhere.
We were the 6th or 7th stop on this winter tour, and they had an open date, and so they called and asked if the Surf Ballroom would be interested, and the Surf said yes. We didn't realize what a strain this was on this crew because they had done the Twin Cities. They were eventually, went to Fargo. They were doing the northern Midwest, and we were on open date. But boy, did they have to strain to get to us. And they'd already had a bus breakdown. They had a trouble with the second one. They had the third bus came to Clear Lake, and it was... The heater wasn't working. Everybody was complaining about how cold it was. So this tour was, it was jinxed almost from the start. And Buddy was the boss. They had a tour manager, but Buddy was telling everybody how this is going to proceed. He said, can you introduce us this way, this way? Absolutely, Buddy, whatever you want, but you're the boss. And boy, was he sharp. Tired, they were dead tired, they were sniffling, coughing, wheezing, but Buddy had control of that whole thing. And the road manager said to me, I love doing this because Buddy's a boss. All I have to do is sit around, drink coffee. Or
and Buddy's
whatever.
just a kid.
Yeah, he was 22 years old.
Yeah, but he was obviously going to be an entrepreneur. And you could see that already coming. I was backstage with Richie, and Richie said, this guy, my friend, He's going to make me a star. Now, he's looking at Buddy Holly, and Buddy is doing everything he can to make all of the performers stars. And Buddy had done a lot of introducing on other record hops. And a couple of times he said, when you introduce so-and-so, I'd like you to say this and this and this. And he said, now, since I have to play the drums, what we're going to do is this. And then he told me how he wanted it. And then Buddy, when I introduced Buddy Holly, he jumped up from the drums, changed his jacket, tie real quick, took off the fedora he was wearing to hide his head while he played the drums.
Oh, so he played in disguise as the drummer.
Yeah.
Oh,
yeah.
He wasn't announced
Buddy
as the
knew
drummer.
how to play the drums. And it was Buddy who's counting off the beats.
Yeah.
Buddy ran the whole show. And as I look
He's the
back
band
at
leader.
it, he probably the way I introduced him was how Buddy wanted him to be introduced.
Yeah.
And when it was all over, at the end of the night, and they're getting in the car to go to the airplane, which is another documentary in itself, Buddy said, hey, we'll see you in June, because they were going to come back with the spring dance party.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
And Buddy was going to build in an extra day so that we could go water skiing. I had the use of my neighbor's boat, and I told him, come up here and we'll all go water skiing. And this one, I'm sorry it didn't get written up, but Buddy and the whole crew fell in love with Wisconsin bratwurst. They had never had it. Remember, they're on the East Coast. West Coast.
Right.
There's no Wisconsin bratwurst out there then. And so when they were doing the Midwest tour in Wisconsin, people, for lunch, they had bratwurst of what is the great stuff. So I said, my wife is from Wisconsin. I went to the university. Our kids will be, forget the formula. The kids are going to eat bratwurst and probably beer as soon as they get home from the hospital after being born. And Buddy said, we love the bratwurst. So I said, you come back in spring, put in an extra day for the spring dance party, and we will have a cookout.
And
Because
some
we
water
had
skiing.
a
I love
little
it.
one-room cottage, good grief, on the lake. But I had a cooker, which Kathy and I had gotten for our wedding. And I said, I'll cook out a couple dozen bratwurst. And they all said, yeah, we'll be. There wasn't a man there who wouldn't have had 4 or 5 bratwurst. I can guarantee you that.
I love that image of like a water skiing Buddy Holly.
Yeah,
That's
I can
pretty
just
great.
picture him with the glasses on.
Yeah.
On the water skis. That's
You
all.
know, I thought about that quite a bit as to which one, who would have stayed up and who would have fallen over.
Like
Well, I'm
who's a
thinking the Big
slalom
Bopper would
skier.
have fallen over pretty quickly.
Bopper would have to go and give us a splash. I think Buddy would have probably tried to master it. I don't know what to say about Dion, in all honesty. You didn't bring up Dion, but I did. It's sort of a sad case in right now. Every so often I exchange, maybe once a year, a little email note with him. But I don't want to. Dion was doing drugs. Mm-hmm. This is no secret now, and he's cleaned his act up. But he also maintains that he flipped a coin for the airplane seat. He didn't. At that point, Dion was in the bus, having dessert in the arm, I guess, and he was not involved at all in the flip of the coin.
Yeah, can you kind of explain sort of how this happened? I mean, Buddy had chartered the plane, and he was on, and Waylon Jennings, and I'd like to get back to him, had given up his spot to the Big Bopper, right?
Right.
And so then, kind of where did things stand?
Well,
after that?
we've got. Now, as I get older, some of the names, one time I did an interview and I included Elvis Presley, which shows you where this interview may
He
go
was there?
yet. So when Bing Crosby and Bob Hope were looking for a seat, it boiled down to Buddy, obviously, he made the call. And then there a conflict backstage of who's going to go and who isn't. And so I flipped the coin for, you're going to have to, because I get confused now.
Well, Buddy's
Buddy's set. He's on.
Right.
He's on. And
there are, what, four
his,
seats?
His other guitar player, Tommy Alsop, right, was part of this.
Right. And Tommy, so then Richie, or Bopper, said to Tommy, can I get your seat? And he said, we'll flip a coin. Now, here's where Tommy and I differ. Tommy maintains he flipped the coin, but I know that Tommy gave me the coin. I didn't have one.
Mm-hmm.
he and I have had very friendly discussions over this, and we can't have him anymore because he passed away last year, and which is very sad. One of the nicest guys in the world. I love that man. And we'd meet once a year at the Surf Ballroom, and we'd joke about flipping a coin, and I said, well, I got some square coins, I got some phony coins. We joke about there are people who want to make a big issue out of who flipped the coin. And I could not care less who wants to own that. That means nothing to say, hey, I flipped a coin that killed somebody.
Why do you think it's important to people to continue to talk about who or who didn't flip a coin?
For some folks, an event is very important in their lives, or it's a milestone, and they want to know as much about it as they can so that in a conversation of three guys, they can be the expert. I've been guilty of that myself. I know a few things that have taken place in the Chicago area that I, quote, I know about. That's before I got into broadcasting, that I can try to palm myself off. I got into a conversation with somebody years ago about where the Brookfield Zoo is. They had the Brookfield Zoo where the Lincoln Park Zoo is. I was born and reared in Brookfield, not the zoo, but I went to the zoo many times. I felt an expert. The guy virtually called me a liar. He said, the zoo is down by the lake. I said, that's the Lincoln Park Zoo. No, that's the Brookfield. No, it's out by. So people want to own
and they want to be authoritative
of events or places. And I understand that. I think I have a few of those myself. Of course I do. That's why I'm talking about.
But this is also like a heavily mythologized event, right? This is like
part of it was part of the it was part of La Bamba, right? They recreated that in that movie.
Sure. Well, unfortunately, that movie had the whole concert in a theater, and everybody was sitting at the Clear Lake Theater, which existed, but we didn't do anything down at the Clear Lake Theater. That's Hollywood, and that's why I have very little contact when people want me to connect with the showing of that movie. It's too many things are wrong in that movie. I don't want to be associated.
But really, it's the song, isn't it? I mean, isn't it Don McLean's song or whatever? That's to me. I mean, I'm in my 40s, so I'm even a little bit young for that tune. But that song, I don't know. I mean, I think that is the narrative that people know, and it's just I think we're exiting the rock age. We're in a fully on hip hop era, but for people who cared about rock and roll, this was a seminal moment and a moment of great loss.
And you've got it nailed pretty much on the head. From my conversations with McNeil at the Surf Ballroom he said, I just think we need something to commemorate it. And he said, this and this. But we both came to the conclusion, if there's a fact that's not right, is this a big deal? No, but the thing where my hackles is when people call me a liar, and they put a couple of words in front of that.
Adjectival.
No, we had one guy who took me to task at the Surf Ballroom. Finally said, "You weren't even there, you liar." And somebody said to him, "What are you talking about?" Bob was the MC. Yeah, but he wasn't there for the show. Because a man was so tied up with his facts.
Right.
And for any major event, there are always many sets of facts. How many bullets were fired?
Sure.
When
Dealey
the president
Plaza
was shot to death.
Right.
Huh? Okay.
Well, we're soon going to know. We're releasing all those records thanks to Oliver Stone.
Yeah, so I understand that people can imagine things. We got into a long conversation with a psychologist about this when I was doing television here in Chicago. And we had a psychologist or a psychiatrist. We were talking about people and events and how if we had, and he said, we're doing a morning talk show. He said, if I went down the dial for your other talk shows, your competitors, and we were talking about X, he said, I'll bet we'd have 3 versions of X. And I immediately thought of this. Of course, you're going to have 3 versions of what happened. And how many bullets were fired when Jack Kennedy was assassinated? 2, 3, 4, 10, 20 echoes. What difference does it make of how many this, how many that? What happened that night is Buddy Holly hired an airplane The guys decided among themselves who's going on the airplane. The plane took off, it crashed, and all 4 of them died.
Right.
That's the event.
Right. And
you have to have ownership to every fact, 100%, and to damn somebody. And I've had it a few times. One guy called me up and used the language. SOB does not mean save our boots, I tell you that. But that's I was a boot saver that day because you weren't even there. And you get that. So that's not the important thing. We lost 3 great performers and a neighbor of mine who was the pilot, 21 years old, a young pilot, and then they tried to blame the pilot.
Right.
And people read this and they read that, and they said, well, the altimeter was the altimeter, that. The wind shear, which we did not know about wind shear until it was 15, 18 years after that, they came up with the term wind shear. And many of us believe that that plane, while it was in a takeoff mode, was blown to the ground by the incredible force. And Kathy and I were driving home, and that wind was coming against our car, and it was blowing the car off the road
That night.
Yeah. Now, granted, we had a lot of ice on there, so it could blow it. But you put a plane in that with this kind of pumping of wind, and you didn't know about wind shear, could take an airplane straight down. And that, I believe, is what happened. The Civil Aeronautics Board, is that what they call it? Yeah, Civil Aeronautics Board is what they called it then, before the FAA, did not know anything about wind shear. We never heard of it.
So
Then
they said pilot
came
error.
out later.
Yeah.
And so that's what many of us believe happened. And the owner of the plane believes the same thing, that it's the wind who did it. And he said, I would not have put an inexperienced pilot on that plane. And the theory is that he read the altimeter backwards. No, that plane was pushed down. The wind was incredible that night.
And you, from what I have read, you went home, you had to get to bed because you were on for the morning shift at the radio station.
Can I interrupt before
Yeah,
we
sure,
talk
go
about?
ahead.
I want to ask about the show.
Oh,
So
yeah,
just
okay.
real quickly,
I can answer both of you. You now, and then I'll talk.
Yeah.
Okay.
But so this, I just want to
outside
go.
of my
What
mouth.
so did you like rock and roll at that time? You were playing it on the radio professionally,
Here's
and then I want to know, like
Yeah.
these guys didn't have big amps. They're probably playing through the house sound or something. What did it
the
sound like?
System. Yeah, oh yeah, it was nothing sophisticated like we have today. Surf Ballroom, count 'em, one microphone, one. Well, we were able to get a second one in so we could pick up an amplifier. That was it, to pick it up.
And there were
this.
2,000 kids in the room.
Yeah.
So what did it sound? I mean, do you remember? What was it? You sat through the show or stood through it, or?
Actually, it's not going to make that much difference because we had 2,000 screaming kids.
Okay, so like
Scream. That's the greatest ovation I've ever had in my life.
whether or not they heard any of it, it's like the Beatles at Comiskey or something, right?
Introduced me. I was ready to go off the stage. Hey, let's do that again. I like it. And I will tell you, I was sweating in the arms like I am now because television scares me. And that was the biggest night, biggest crowd Surf Ballroom ever had. They counted. It was the biggest audience I'd ever had in my life. And the biggest show that had ever come to Mason City and Clear Lake. And so it was big for everybody.
It was a thing.
Interesting note. When Carol Anderson started these rock and roll shows with the other radio station in town, he insisted the parents come along, free. Why? To drive the kids to and from, keep the kids out of the cars, keep them off the roads. So we probably had 30, 40 parents there. A lot of kids walked. Some of them, a few of them tried their bicycle that night. I remember that. They're trying to bike. That didn't work too well. But a lot of them doubled up, tripled up in cars. A lot of them walked or were driven there. So we had a good showing of parents, along with all the
It's
the high
interesting. I
school-
don't think of it as like a chaperoned event. That's interesting.
Yeah, well, sort of. But here's something else we had. I just remembered it. We had a lot of college kids show up. Nearby, I may be wrong, but I think it was Waverly, there is a Lutheran, at that time, a 2-year Lutheran college. Freshman, sophomore. Now, being Lutheran, I can say this in the terms I want to say it, because Lutherans, I can offend myself.
Right. Speak freely.
We Lutherans come in various barrels, like olives. And some are very conservative, grim people. Others are lackadaisical. Now, the lackadaisical ones tend to come from the North countries, some Sweden, some North Germany, They're a little bit looser. But at that time, the Lutheran College in Waverly was very strict. Alcohol, remember, it's 2 years, and be very this, to be very that. Here's how you treat people. Never would they hold a dance on the campus of a Lutheran.
Sure.
It was the agent of the devil back then. Now they have dances 2, 3, 4 times a year. And it's a 4-year college, I believe. But these kids were doing something they shouldn't. They went to a public dance. And they next day announced it on radio that they had been at the dance. They came out to the radio station. I must have interviewed 50, 60 high school and college kids that came there. Those students who came to the Surf that night and publicly announced on radio that they belonged to Waverly College and had been at a dance got expelled for a month or 6 weeks or something. And then they were reconstituted, reformed Lutherans.
And they were doing these interviews with you because of the news. They were talking about the experience.
They wanted to talk about it. And they were willing to go public that they shouldn't have been at the dance, but they said, as many did, what you had last night at that dance were some of the greatest performers, best performers in the business today. When you had Buddy and Richie and the Bopper and Dion and the Belmonts. My goodness. And they were. I mean, Dion, even though he and I have a disagreement on several things, I don't even know if we'd be talking to each other, but I respect that man for his incredible talent and what image on stage he presents to young people. Fantastic. So that show was high class. And we had a lot of parents. The manager of the ballroom, Carol Anderson, always invited parents.
Why? So why is that notable? Do you think? I mean, because rock is a youthful art form. It was a rebellious art form. It was sexualized music in the post-war era.
Well, I think you touched on it there. Why it was looked upon negatively? Sexualized music, yeah. Looser than, and my parents said, from what they could tell, it was as loose as the Charleston in that era. And my mother said to me, I don't know who was wilder, the kids that you entertain or me when I went to the dances in the 20s.
Well, those 20s kids were pretty advanced.
Yeah. I love my wife, but oh, you kid, and the flappers and all of that. And I asked my dad about that. And my dad being, I don't know where I would have got my smart mouth from, but my dad looked at me and said, I ain't talking. That was it. He didn't want to talk. I ain't talking. So
good policy.
I think some of that flapper era carried over. And the kids wanted to expect, they wanted their stuff. They didn't want their parents' big bands. That's when the big band era started to die.
Yeah.
They didn't want the Dorsey brothers. Some of them didn't even like Kenton. He was new and fresh but different, but they didn't care for that. Guy Lombardo, come on, forget Lombardo and all of that.
It's not even close, to be frank.
So you had the morning shift the night after that concert, so you were there at 9 a.m. How did you find out what had happened? When you were you on the air when you found out?
In the back room, which is from here to the next table, is the news machine. We had United Press International. I mean, you get 2 bells, you go back, it's a weather report. You get 3 bells, it could be the weather's picking up, or the governor has stated that he has sold Iowa to Minnesota or something like that. You got 5 bells. You get 5 bells, you go back, what's going on? Are we being invaded by Canada or Mexico? You know, that kind of thing. 5 bells. And I looked at it, and it said, the wreckage of a small plane has been sighted outside north of Mason City. and pilot, etc., had not been identified. I tore it off. I interrupted the music, and I read the bulletin. I had not made a connection yet.
Huh.
I didn't even think of that airplane, because what we thought we knew was that the plane took off, and by now the guys are all in North Dakota. And about 2 minutes later, the private line rang. The Surf Ballroom manager, Carol Anderson, called. He said, "Bob, about that plane crash, I just came back from it." I said, "You did? Well, why were you there?" He said, "Bob, every time I do this, I choke up again. Bob, Richie, Buddy, and the Bopper are dead. They died in a plane crash along with Roger." And I said, "This is a bad joke, I hope." "Bob, I just identified their bodies." I just hung up the phone, and I went back into the studio, and we were playing the Pick album of the week. And some cut was on there. I opened the microphone, and normally you turn the volume down on something when you're going to talk. My left hand just swept the needle right off I wouldn't even think, went, and I said, I have to interrupt. And Carol Anderson just called to tell me about that plane crash. And this is one of the most difficult things I think I will ever face in this business. But he told me that Buddy Holly, Richie Valens, the Big Bopper, and my next door neighbor, the pilot, Roger Peterson, were killed in that plane crash. I said, I don't know what else I can say. And I reached over and picked up the Pick album of the week, which was Buddy Holly's. I put it on and played it. The phone is now ringing. We don't have our secretaries in yet, our phone operator in. And so I'm answering the phone. Private line is ringing because some officials in town knew it. And I called my boss. I said, "You got to get in here." He said, "We've got a problem." I explained it to him, and he uttered a few words, and they came in and brought another disc jockey in eventually, because I was now suddenly being interviewed all over the country. The press put it out on the wires all over the U.S. and Canada.
Do you break that story then? I mean, if the UPI was reporting that the plane was crashed, and then you went on the air moments later to announce that it was Buddy Holly, are you the first reporter to place Buddy Holly in the crash?
Yeah. And then I got scared because I didn't have an official. When I mean official, I mean like fireman or policeman.
Right. That's what I was just thinking.
Confirmed to me that indeed that's Buddy Holly's body. But on the other hand, it was Carol Anderson who looked in that plane and saw the 4 dead bodies, and he knew all 4.
Right.
And when he described to me the condition of those bodies, I would not have dared to repeat that on the air, and we never did. Yeah. But they were destroyed. They were. One of them was ripped up the middle. One had the top of his head gone, and another one had every bone in his body broken. So that's enough of that.
There's a memorial at the crash site now. Yeah. Have you ever visited it?
I have. There's another story for my wife and for me. I frequently get invited back to the surf in February for a winter dance party, and usually a memorial. And the devotees always of the 3 guys and rock and roll buffs go out and make a pilgrimage. First time, second time I drove out there, I drove out to the farm, drove to the road, and I could see the memorial off to my left. And I suddenly felt my hands trying to crush the steering wheel. I couldn't get myself out of the car. I could not walk over there. I started to sweat, and I started to shake. I didn't go. And for the next 2 years after that, I didn't go. In the 5th year, my wife decided to come with me. She said, "You're going to do it this year. You need to do this." So we did. And we got out there with some other devotees out there taking pictures, and people starting to take my picture, and we got out there. And we knelt down. Snow had been brushed away, so I could read the plaques. And, by now it's not going to bother me until I looked up at my wife. And we both started to cry. It may sound like I'm getting choked up now. Gee, I wonder why. we both, the tears just flowed, because Kathy fell in love with the whole performers. She even said, I wish Dion were around here. I think we could help him. She knew Dion was hooked. We all could tell it. But she said, this is no way for those people to die. This should have been no way for them to die. There's a memorial there. There are all sorts. Every year somebody brings candles. One fellow walked up there and he said, I once was studying for the priesthood, and even my church doesn't have this many candles going as we've got here. It is almost, and for some it is, a religious sight and experience.
It's a terrible tragedy, and it took very young lives. But it's not unique in the history of American music that musicians die on the road. No. I mean, Bessie Smith, didn't she die in a car crash in Clarksdale? And I mean, this is... So why this? Why this pilgrimage? Why this event? Why these deaths?
I've gotten in discussions with disc jockeys. When I came to WLS, this was a frequent conversation at dinner. I was grilled many times. And we seem to come to this conclusion. I don't want to say this is 100% accurate, but... Other plane crashes and others who died were not this popular with the youngest of the generation, who are the most articulate about who they love. Country western singers, they affect people your age, my age.
Williams was
29, 27, 28.
Yeah. Now, there are others of that age. Elvis? Of course. But these guys had immediate communication with every high schooler in the country, 8th grade, 7th grade, and into college, because I had college kids came to the radio station. I don't know if I mentioned the group of them that got dismissed because they took the time off. Well, Elvis obviously affected. Had we had, say, the death of, at that time, popular singers like Crosby, Como, band leaders, would not have had this effect, because the kids were not identifying with that generation. And it was moving fast. New singers every few months, every year.
Yeah.
Different this, different. There were singers who stood out. And all three of those group performers were unique. There was no other Buddy Holly. There was no other Richie Valens. There certainly was no other Big Bopper. They were unique, and nobody could be them. No one could take their place or sound like them or get away with it. And the other thing, well, at least locally, no show this big had ever been in central Iowa. This was the biggest thing the teenagers had ever seen or heard or could be allowed to attend. And it also affected adults, because we opened it up. Parents came in free. We had several dozen parents there that night. And this was played up in media.
Right.
The newspaper was not the friends of our radio station, but they still played it up. They gave it a good plug. And
I think your point is really well made. That, and let me rephrase it. I mean, this is really a boomer phenomenon. You're talking about teenagers, and this is news because it's a boomer event, and all we hear about is our boomer events in the United States.
Yeah.
Okay. Now I understand.
So, and just, obviously, I'm sure that, it had a deep impact on you. It had a deep impact on Waylon Jennings, who apparently made an offhand comment after the coin flip about he wasn't going to be on the plane, and that haunted him.
I hope your plane crashes.
Yeah,
and boy, did that bother him afterwards. And years after.
Did you ever talk to him about that afterwards?
Oh, yeah. Well, we did once.
Okay.
When Waylon came, it's his first time back. And I had been going back, not everyone, but when I came to Chicago, I started going back to them. And I'll tell you another one that got to me more than Waylon. I'm talking about Waylon, and I also want to talk about, come on, he just died. Why am I having a blank? Waylon,
who was there, or a different play? You mean like Merle Haggard?
No. Who was with
Glenn
us?
Campbell?
Isn't this terrible that I can't?
Tom Petty, recent deaths, David Bowie. Terrible
guitar singer.
From that era?
From that night with the group. Backing up.
We just talked about him. The guy
we
who
just
was
got
the good.
Tommy also.
Also,
Thank you, boy. And
I don't know him.
I thought you were
I don't know
talking
him.
about somebody else.
And Tommy.
Sorry.
I know. We have so many names
Deadpool.
in there, and I try to keep this straight, and sometimes it all starts to crash. Well, gray hair suggests that there was very little blood running in his brain. Anyway,
Please don't say that.
But Tommy, Tommy really felt bad because he gave up his seat. He was involved in the coin toss. Mm-hmm. So we have a lot of people with slightly different reasons for being very seriously and deeply affected by this plane crash. Tommy said that he was ready to just quit the business and go hide somewhere. Others were just absolutely ripped. And of course, you've got the folks in Iowa who have one of their 21-year-old pilots who died in a plane crash, and people tried to heap the fault on them. We had that event going on, that show, if you want to call it that, going on for decades. People cursed that man, and cursed the pilot.
Yeah.
And then there was one guy who went, I think it was in print and in an interview, let me have it because Hale wasn't even there that night. So, okay. Well,
right.
And then we have a guy who wrote a book who had two shows, that there was an early show and a late show, and that I was late for the first show. Where that came from, I don't know. We had one show. We did not have two shows. And I'm not even going to mention the author's name. I don't want to plug the book.
That's good.
It's a bum book.
Yeah. So
it's a bum book.
The unnamed bum book.
So a couple of years after that, you end up in Chicago at WLS, and I'd kind of like to talk to you about sort of, you were part of a revolution in Chicago radio broadcasting because WLS was the home of the National Barn Dance and, was the
world's largest
store
store
for farmers.
Yeah.
One thing that helped WLS make a transition from being the voice of agriculture and the Prairie Farmer Station was the fact that WJJD was already doing rock and roll, and WJJD had their top 40 list that was out. WJJD's problem was the fact it was higher on the dial than 1,000, which is about as far as most people went to WCFL. They didn't go to, unless you were, say, Moody Bible Institute, which is nudged to the right, and you liked the music JJD was playing, or you were a foreign language listener, and we had several foreign language stations on the right side of the dial.
Also, WJJD was just a daytime station with not a lot of wattage, right? I mean, WLS had 50,000 watts.
They ran daytime, but the license allowed them 24 hours a day.
Okay.
Because eventually, when I went to work at WJJD down the line, we were on the air around the clock.
Oh, okay.
And WLS, which 50,000 watts clear channel, could have been clear 24 hours, but it went off at midnight. However, you're talking to the guy who was the first all-night, in-the-dark announcer for WLS in 1960. And the Friday night before we went on the air with the new format, and we only had 3 of the disc jockeys in town yet on that night, Sam Holman, Dick Biondi, and me. And Saturday night, after the barn dance and all that, may have been Friday, we went on the air after sign-off, and we did a half hour of Call Us Collect. We didn't want to go much further because we knew the power we had, we'd be paying big phone bills to Call Us Collect. But we had calls from right off the bat. Hello, Hawaii. Oh, good grief.
Wow.
Nova Scotia. And somebody on the west coast of one of the British islands has called us. We accepted the call. And several ships at sea. At that point, Sam Holman, program director, looked at Biondi and me. He said, guys, we have a monster
You
on
got
our
some
hands.
reach.
And he's looking at Dick and me because Dick was on 9 to midnight. So he was early guy with the big power and the darkness, which makes a radio signal almost go around the whole earth and come back at itself. And then me, from midnight to 5:30 in the morning, we got the whole North American continent listening in, and then we found out we got a few more. I had a couple hello calls from Africa, many from South America. I had a fan club at an American military post that could not be named. So I said,
Cold War base,
Huh?
Cold War base or something. Yeah,
Yeah, Cold War. And I said to these guys, can I ask you a couple questions about where you are? He said, yeah. I said, you hear us at night? Yeah. I said, if you go out the door, would you freeze any part of your... He said, oh, yeah, cold. I said, so would I be safe in saying you are closer to the North Pole than I am? He said, yeah, that's accurate. Well, I realized we have secret bases up there. I mean, it's a secret. No, it's secret. We knew we had bases. And I said, if you were to slide the radio dial off to the right, would you be hearing a foreign language that sound a little Slavic? He said, oh, yeah. I said, you guys happen to drink vodka at all? He said, mm-hmm. So what we had was our secret base that listened to everything Russia was doing. That kept a watch, and I found out later, everybody knew it was up there. And these guys were
They're
hungry.
WLS fans. That's really funny.
Yeah, they were hungry for American radio, and we satisfied that hunger. I got notes from them. They couldn't send it from there. They had to send it home and have somebody
Reroute it. So this was a rock format that you were playing.
Absolutely.
Is that right? Rock and roll. So
Yeah.
this was the format change, and
Sure.
you've got people sitting on probably an Air Force base or
Oh, yeah.
Army Air Corps base,
Yeah,
listening to you spin. What were you? So 1960, 1961.
Sure.
These were programmatic.
Pre-British
this is the
invasion.
stuff that the young military
Fats.
guys were playing at the jukebox at whatever they had for entertainment at their bases. Yeah. And now they got on radio and they heard a warm voice. Well, they heard a voice. I don't know what's warm. But they knew I was
warm.
alive. Yeah. But what was really neat for me was to get a phone call, which I had several after that, or a little note from the servicemen who were in the Chicago area.
Sure.
And a couple of them I met later. And I'll tell you, I choked up because I knew they were coming home. And I said, you guys ever get, near us? I don't know where you're from, but if you're ever near Chicago, you know where WLS is. And one day I was on the air. Now, the time schedule on the air eventually shifted about a year and a half later. So I was doing early evening at that time. So I wasn't in touch with these guys, but I saw 3 military guys come in after hours, and I'm on the air, and I said, I'll bet you these are guys from up north. And the host, our secretary at the front desk, waved at me to come out and meet 3 guys who had my northernmost fan club because they were stationed up there at the Circle. Mm-hmm. And,
wow.
Boy, if that doesn't warm your heart.
That's pretty cool.
To know that they missed home, that our radio station, along with others, were a touch of home for them, and that they cared enough to come say thank you. Wow. That was almost worth a week's salary. Almost. Not.
Hey, one thing I wanted to ask you is, so you're spinning rock and roll records, from 1959 into the 60s at WLS. When you went home at night, what would you listen to? What
Classical music.
Okay.
My wife and I love classical music. We subscribed as soon as we could figure out a schedule to the Chicago Symphony concerts, which several of them I had to pass up when I slipped into early evenings.
Right.
I could go to the CSO and then walk down the street and go on the air. Tired, but I could go on and do 6 hours of rock and roll after listening to Beethoven, which is fine. Excellent. It was good for the soul, and it said to Kathy and to me that we had ecumenical tastes.
What about, you must have played a lot of rock and roll. Who were the acts that, I don't know, maybe were your favorite, or I don't know if you listen to rock and roll music today, but what are the acts
I don't listen much today because what you're calling rock and roll today is a different genre than the rock and roll of the 50s and 60s, a different style. But I've always been a classical music, I say always, from college days I was a classical music listener. I mean, I can't quote composers or some orchestra leaders, but I lived, when I was on campus at the University of Wisconsin, the rooming house I was in was as close to my broken down rooming house as the wall is from here. 8 feet, maybe. And the windows were always open because that old building did not have air conditioning, where the pianists were getting their training. So I heard a lot of classical piano music, and then they bring in a trumpet or a violin. So I was getting free entertainment from these guys.
That's great.
And so I've always liked classical music. I took a couple courses in the history of classical music, which I think served me well when it came to rock and roll, because once in a while you'd get a rock and roll tune that was based on classical music. You know, and boy, I got a kick out of that.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I always think of it as a blues-based form and not not a Western classical music
Yep.
form.
Well, I think it's a great mix of all of that. Great mix.
And then, kind of in the mid-'60s, maybe mid to late '60s, you switched to TV as your medium, and which is, I find, really interesting. You spent a long time as the host of the Today in Chicago show, which led into the Today Show, right?
Right. Well, television is always going to be a lure for anybody in broadcasting, but you always worry, am I beautiful enough for the tube? I was worried, do I have the emotional stability to handle hot lights and a camera and people watching me? And I always worried that my nose was dripping. I had a couple bad. Hey, you got to think about these things.
I mean,
yeah. And then a newsman said, "Now don't forget, the color of your jackets and your shirts should always be dark." Why? You don't want them to see the perspiration of your armpits. That's direct. Yep. That tells me
practical
now my
advice,
jacket
right?
showing a wet armpit from nervousness. Mm-hmm. The first television.
Richard Nixon did not get that advice.
Well, that's it. No, let's not go down that road.
Chicago broadcasting history.
To interview Richard Nixon. There's one man I really wish I could have interviewed. I think Richard Nixon was one of the most interesting and charismatic politicians in my lifetime. I did not use words like effective.
Certainly interesting.
But he was, in his way. I had my likes and dislikes, but about every politician. You got me off on that now. I mean,
sorry.
Well, no, I've interviewed Republicans and Democrats, and I've sneered at both of them.
Who was your favorite interview?
My favorite interview was, you may have to help me here. The Reed boat, the man who went across the ocean.
Heyerdahl?
Thor Heyerdahl. I interviewed twice. He was the most fascinating individual I interviewed, but there are others right behind
That's
him.
Pretty cool.
I'll tell you another one who just scared the bejeebers out of all of us, Madeleine Murray O'Hair. You know her?
Who is that?
She was the queen of atheism in this country.
Oh.
And I had her on the air twice. I got roundly condemned by very religious people.
No.
Oh, yes. No. Yeah. And
they're afraid of her,
religious people, and I'm a churchgoer, but there are a few of those religious people I don't want to meet in a dark alley or in a bright, sunshiny afternoon. They scare me. But Madeleine Murray O'Hair, I don't know if you really want to get into atheism, but for an atheist, she was a charismatic person, an engaging person. She knew what she was talking about, but boy, did she hate. She knew how to hate.
It's funny. A lot of evangelicals must have learned that from her.
Oh, I didn't dare get into some well-known preachers with her because I knew where she'd go with them. Well, a few of them I have some thoughts about too, but that's another story.
Yeah, right.
You want to get into that, but
we can have you back, Bob, for the religious show.
Yeah. I would say, though, if you want to say who was your favorite interview, I put Tor Heyerdahl right up there as 1, 2, or 3. A, because he's a good interview, but B, because of the chances he took with his life and with others and what he was trying to accomplish so that we understood our globe a little bit better, to the point where I sometimes got choked up talking about him, where he opened up the world literally to people who would take the time to read and to listen to him. I think he's probably one of the greatest people I ever interviewed was Tor Heyerdahl. Absolutely. Oh, then there's the other one, however, and this my kids got a kick out of. I interviewed and saw, without his mask, the Lone Ranger. I had breakfast with the bare-faced Lone Ranger.
Wow.
Naked face.
Which the
television?
Okay, okay.
He was part of the Lone Ranger was played by. See now at my age,
and I don't know.
Yeah.
And I do.
This is before my time.
I'm
I don't
older
know.
than him, so now I'm starting
Yeah,
to forget
Bob.
names as well. But
So
I
if we
can't
don't
remember.
It'll come up.
Yeah,
But
right.
Heyerdahl, what's cool about him was he
gonna find
he
out.
had a theory about basically immigration across the ocean, right? And that primitive people could have floated between continents. That was what he was trying to
We're
prove
back
with
to
Kon-Tiki.
Tor.
Yeah.
Yeah, not the Lone Ranger.
No. Yeah, the Lone Ranger's just
The Lone
some
Ranger-
he may have had
candy,
Yeah.
just some cartoon. But
the part of the Lone Ranger on radio was played by Brace Beamer. The part of the Lone Ranger on television was played by
I'm getting it.
I'm going to give you the wrong name. You're going to get it
Yeah,
on
I'm
the
gonna get
machine.
it if I
All right,
can.
we'll get it.
if you can get some service back.
Tor, you were talking about Tor Heyerdahl.
Just it's a name that I don't hear a lot
Clayton
anymore.
Moore.
Clayton Moore, of course. I'll tell you a great Clayton Moore story. Now that I got his name.
Oh, well, we can come back to it.
No,
It's a
go
name
ahead.
you don't hear a lot. It was a seminal event, and what's interesting to me, we talked about people and their unwillingness to deal with fact or counterfact, and what was interesting to me about Heyerdahl's project was that it was really one that was supposed to prove that Western Europe wasn't necessarily wasn't the font of world culture. And
He was
that
able
primitive
to
people
float and
couldn't
say a lot of what we believe is wrong.
Yeah.
And he did it, he was so sincere about what he wanted to do. His first attempt didn't work right. So he builds a second boat, a boat made out of reed. We're talking about reed is fat grass. That's what it is. He's floating the oceans in a grass boat.
Yeah.
And he doesn't drink. So, as far as I know. But to come up with this idea and the stories he would tell about the storms, about the reed starting to break, and maybe the boat's going to, the first one fell apart. But the second boat, which I saw in Europe when I was over there with my wife a few years ago, to say this is the boat that Tor was telling me about. If it wasn't for this boat, I wouldn't have had the interview with him. And I just stood there and I said to the boat, Ra 2. Mm-hmm. I looked at it and I said, Ra, thank you. You made me good on television, because the Tor Heyerdahl interview got some applause from my bosses, which I fairly rarely got, and from a couple of newspaper things, and people remembered it, not because of the way I conducted it, but because of what Heyerdahl had to say. Mm-hmm. The man put his life and others on the line to prove a theory, and he proved it right, that they could float from here to there, from there to here, because we have currents in the ocean, and that's how it could be done. They weren't all out there with paddles, and they didn't have Johnson outboard motors. They had to use their arms, elbows, and shoulders. And by golly, they did it. And I interviewed Heyerdahl twice. One of the finest people I think that I ever interviewed.
It's really interesting.
If he were alive today, and if I were still working in the business, I'd make sure I had
Do another
Heyerdahl
one.
on once a year. He's a fantastic man.
That's really cool.
Yeah. You know, Bob, we could probably have this conversation for 2 more hours.
Yeah.
But I think we've
I
gone
bored
on
you
here
to
for a
Yeah,
long
I mean,
time.
we're
So
50 minutes.
maybe
Do you think
maybe
you have an
another time-
audience left? Now, this is a question you guys.
Well, you know,
you think you have anybody
the
listening?
4 or 5
after
people,
this?
they usually
Okay,
make it this
well,
far.
Yeah,
good.
right.
God bless the 4 or 5 people.
But anyway, I really appreciate you coming out here and talking with us, and maybe we'll have you back
Yeah,
because
please.
there's a lot more to
I
talk
tell
about.
you, if you want to be compassionate people, now
Yeah.
listen to me, man. I'm older than both of you combined. If you want to be compassionate people, remember you're talking to a guy who decided in 4th grade he was going to be at that time in radio. There was no TV. I went and did what I wanted to do. I miss it. Have me back anytime you want. Because I feel now doing this. My heart is now beating at 72 per minute as it's supposed to, not 41. And I thank you very much. I think you guys are doing just good stuff because our communication system has changed so radically. But these small, intimate kinds of conversations where you can guess what my next question might be and have fun about it and not have somebody panic and say, oh, my God, the network is coming. You got to get off the air. This is real communication. So you don't know how much I appreciate it because it means now if I ever do this again, I have to go see my doctor and get the brain cleared.
Well, thank you very much.
Guys.